Greetings, this is Dr. Rich McConnell. I'm joined today with Dr. Ken Long and Mr. George Hodge, and we're talking about the effects of simple role-playing games on the wargaming step of the military decision-making process, and this is the fifth and final webinar for our research project conducted here at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And without any further ado, let me just pass this over to my colleague, Mr. Hodge, regarding visualization.
Hi. One of the things that is always a challenge for us is to create the ability to visualize events of the future. And what I mean by that is more than just kind of see how things might unfold. We've got to understand that there's a range of options from the most plausible to even improbable. But more so than just visualizing various approaches, we also have to develop the skill that allows us to anticipate likely reactions. And so kind of the big question that we deal with is, what do you mean by visualizing and how do we access it? And so if you think about all the possible things that can happen and all the various inputs, we've got to come up with some form of order that these things are going to occur in. And so when we deal with these, we'll also look at what are the kind of skills that enable us to do this. And so practical exercises, personal experiences, various case studies and discussions are some of the ways that we help to build this skill. And so the challenge is how exactly or what kind of methods can we use to do this. And so that's kind of the big challenge of this is, what are some of the ways? And so, possible practical exercises and actually conducting war games, or having someone play the adversary, are some of the ways that we try to do this.
Okay, so bottom line up front for what we discovered as a result of this study was that it seemed like the more that we looked at what we learned from the results of playing Kriegspiel and how it helped us stress test our plans, was that this skill could be applied to all kinds of different disciplines and pursuits. We find that decision makers really grapple with the unknown. And if a decision maker can actually anticipate that which is unknown at the outset of planning and anticipate the emergence of a threat or an opportunity, they can get a definitive advantage over other players within the environment. So we believe that what we learned through this process, Mr. Hodges talked about visualization. It's almost like a muscle, we think. In the last webinar, Mr. Miller talked about possibly people from the neurobiological discipline looking at what part of the brain lights up when people actually are visualizing, and if we stimulated that enough, would people get better at it? And so this is more than just military planners trying to anticipate the unexpected. This can be applied to business leaders trying to anticipate what market variables might be in place in the process of bringing a new product to market, for example, or educational professionals attempting to figure out how to improve people's ability to use a combination of creative and critical thinking to anticipate what might be coming in the future through a kind of prediction or forecasting. This is applicable to all kinds of disciplines.
So what are some of the recommendations that we came up with? And whenever we do this process of the visualization, we always tend to tell people to war game these events. And one thing to think about for the war game is really kind of the purpose of it. And while the purpose of it really is for us to help us visualize the upcoming actions and what our reactions and even our counteractions might be, it really is a form of us being able to rehearse the actions that we would take and the mechanisms we would put in place, not only as a result, but actually to preempt the various options that might be thrown at us. Another way to look at this is the purpose of us doing this is to really test and validate our hypothesis. And not only should we take the one that is the one that we develop, but we also need to look at the range of possible events, from the most plausible to the unlikely to perhaps even the one that is what we call the black swan. And so I tell people, think of this as putting your plan inside a vise and tightening it down as far as it can go. And at what point does it break? And if it breaks, it should break well beyond the threshold of very likely and possible actions. And so by this, we tell people that this is probably the most important step that you do as part of the wargaming, is to not only synchronize and coordinate everything, but also to really test your hypotheses in this case. And one of the things that we identify is those shortcomings that we can fix and the areas of risk that we're likely to encounter.
So we discovered a number of things that might be of interest to people conducting research in similar or related studies. Those of us on the research team for this study thought it would be interesting to conduct a longitudinal study to determine how many times we could replicate these findings, if at all. We made some discoveries about the visualization quiz. When we did our first iteration, if somebody had no answer or a wrong answer, we gave them a score of 0 for both. But we decided that in another iteration of this, we would prefer to have no answer being a 0 and a wrong answer being a 1, with an okay answer being a 2 and a good 3 and perfect 4, and see what effect that might have on our outcomes. Would that give us a little more fidelity on what we think we understand about what we're observing? We had some ideas about relooking how the game theory variable section of our visualization quiz was depicted to our participants, that there might have been some confusion on the way we depicted that. So maybe a better narrative explaining what we're asking them to measure would be something that we would look at. And that was an interesting discovery for us, because as many people conducting research might relate, that after you've been looking at something for a while, it seems to make sense to you, but it's like what Mr. Hodges said about, testing your plan. Well, we kept learning things about visualization and the anticipating of the unexpected throughout the study itself, which was very interesting. Also, we have an example of what we might use next time for a protocol for the faculty wargaming observer sheet. As we had shared in previous webinars, we had faculty members that were not the teachers of the students observe their wargaming step of the military decision-making process and count up the discoveries by warfighting function. And we found that at the end of that, we had some recommendations to improve that product, to make it more user-friendly to the observers, and perhaps provide a little more rigor in what we were actually measuring. And then one of the last things we'll talk about is just some potential alternative studies that we could conduct that looks at this phenomenon from different perspectives, such as cultural and different applications of the cognitive planning domains that we developed as the theoretical model for this study. So one of these, this is the example of how to improve our observer sheet. And what this does is, for our wargaming step of MDMP, we usually are wargaming or stress testing plans, as Mr. Hodge put it, for two different courses of action, and that's what's depicted here, COA 1 and COA 2. And this sheet gives a lot more detail. You'll see that the warfighting functions are listed in the second column, and now you can use the different warfighting functions by different types of disciplines in the plan, such as if you look at COA 1, I'm looking at enemy artillery operations, and if I had an intel discovery in that column by warfighting function, I could apply that to how many discoveries were made, because as we said earlier in one of our earlier discussions, is that a discovery was considered more rigorous if you had more warfighting functions. So if it was only one warfighting function, perhaps that wasn't as rigorous as one with 3 or 4 or more. And we thought that this particular instrument might be a little bit easier to use in some ways and might provide us with a little more rigor in what we're measuring.
So one of the things that we kind of came to a conclusion about is the amount of time that we have to use. And for instance, when you see the slide, we have a couple different planning processes. We talk about the Army design methodology, military decision-making process, and the rapid decision-making synchronization process. And the way to look at this is we use Army design methodology when the nature of the problem is very complex. In other words, it's a very unfamiliar but a complex problem. The military decision-making process more so is used when the problem set is fairly familiar to us, and there's a somewhat degree of time available to us. On the other hand, the rapid decision-making synchronization process, normally it's a familiar problem, but it's extremely time-sensitive. And one way to look at this is that when the problem is extremely complex, or let me back up, when the problem is unfamiliar to us, and it's a complex problem, we have plenty of time to kind of sit down and identify the problem. We kind of think of this more as the Art Institute. In other words, we can have some time to lay out the nature of the problem, find the exact issue, and come up with some experimental ideas for that. Likewise, when the problem set is more familiar to us, we think of this more as the laboratory. In other words, we've got the variables, and all we really need to do is analyze them, because the solution to it is something that is probably fairly well known, and we've just got to complete some analysis into it and make some minor adjustments. And so we think of that more of the laboratory. And then finally, when we talk about the rapid decision-making synchronization process, because it's very time sensitive to making a decision, normally this is something that we would consider to be more of the factory. In other words, there is a solution that exists, and it's a matter of not spending a whole lot of time on analysis. We may have to make some decisions on is the solution set close at hand, or do we have to back up a little bit and perhaps go back and do some more analysis and perhaps treat it as if there's some analysis that has to be done before we can pull out what we think is the most appropriate answer.
Okay, so one other aspect of this is the culture of the environments that create decisions, and in our case, the decision makers are our commanders typically. So we have in the staff sort of a CUOPS, we call that the current operations cell, and they focus on really the factory type aspects, and they are directly connected to the commander, helping the commander make decisions as things unfold in the environment. And they use what's known as running estimates, which are a lot like test hypotheses. As we look at what's going on in the environment, what is it that is the data that we're collecting, and what does it mean, and how does it help the commander make the decisions? And throughout all this is other communities such as the FUOPS, which are the future ops people, which CUOPS tends to look at. The current ops people are looking at what's going on in the next day or so. The future ops people are beyond that, out to a week per chance, depending on the unit. And then the plans people go out beyond that even farther. So these are known as planning horizons. And so as you look at this, now we start looking at what theoretical model did we have, and what was the problem, and had it changed? And so what we thought would be an interesting examination of this phenomenon is to look at the commander as the central figure, making decisions based on an uncertain environment, supported by these three communities, the current ops folks that are really on the factory floor, churning out options for the commanders to be used right now and in the near future. And they're going to focus on the factory. Whereas the FUOPS people, they've got a little more time, but they still have to develop plans that will be used in the next few days or to a week. They're focusing on the laboratory. And then the Art Institute people, they're the plans people, using more creativity, and they have more time, and it takes more time to determine if the theoretical model has changed and has the problem that I thought that I was attempting to address, has it changed? And finally, this was something that we thought might be an interesting examination of how planning domains and game theory variables influence decision makers. And we sort of like the old-fashioned slide rule there. You know, all of us make decisions every day, whether we're commanders operating on a battlefield against a thinking and adaptive enemy, or coming here to work today. You know, what route am I going to take? Am I going to stop and run some errands? Whatever. And each one of these problems, some of them are very simple and some of them are not. And so each one of these game theory variables are sort of like a slide rule. So do I have a rational problem or not? And that's a slide rule, right? Do I have enough information? It's enough information or not enough, and somewhere in the middle. All that's sort of like a slide rule. Same thing with common knowledge. How many unknowns are in the environment, and how complex is the environment? And in the center of this is our central figure, is the decision maker. And for the Army, that's the commander. But for businesses, this could be, the CEO, the CFO. For educators, it could be curriculum developers, or the teachers as they are providing instruction, gauging student reactions, etc. And all of these things kind of look at how a decision maker experiences enough confidence using those game theory variables to arrive at a reasonable decision, hopefully as a rational actor. But sometimes there's some judgment that has to be employed, and that's based on your personality, your experience, education, etc. So, to go ahead and wrap up this, this is the conclusion of the fifth and final webinar for our wargaming study here at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Although we were looking specifically at military planners and decision makers, it seems apparent to all of us involved with the study that this could be applicable to any discipline, any environment. And although our findings are preliminary, and there's plenty of room for research, not only where we are looking specifically at military decision makers, but across a myriad of disciplines and pursuits, business, education, etc. On that note, I'll pass it over to Dr. Long, and he can.
Some thoughts that occurred to me. I was putting on the hat of the dean of our college and thinking of the questions he would ask, and he would probably say something like, "Developing visualization through wargaming and experiential learning rests on a number of assumptions." And the first one being that visualization is a thing that we can define, and that it's actually trainable, that it's a skill, or as we described, a muscle that can be developed deliberately. It's not something you're just born with. Second is that the world is such that plans make a difference, that you can do better than random chance or naive optimism, that by making a plan, you can improve your future outcomes, and that you can use judgment to estimate the quality of a plan. You can look at the components of it, see if they make sense, if they fit together, if there's a narrative that connects everything, or you can compare the possible outcomes between plans so that we can make judgments about our plans. And that rests on an assumption that we can know things about the world in a meaningful way, and that the world is relatively stable and consistent so that our rules of thumb can be applied, that what we know today should work tomorrow. So businesses are built on those kinds of assumptions, that we get stable, reliable processes that we have to manage, but that we can, we're not living in a purely chaotic world. You can define problems in environments where that may not always be true, but generally speaking, when you're talking about businesses and large organizations, they're trying to find the efficiencies from stability while handling the uncertainties and the variables. So that's what our dean would say is, why do I think this is trainable? Why do I think the method you've chosen to train it is appropriate and it's worth the squeeze? Because it's going to take me some cost and time and expertise to be able to train visualization in the way you propose. Why is that a good choice? Why is that affordable? Why should I commit the resources of our profession to do that rather than some other method? As a devil's advocate, I could say, I can evaluate the components of your plan. I can apply some expert-based rules. See, have you accounted for known rules of thumb and risk and reward without having to go through some kind of iterative visualizing game? So what kind of thoughts does that trigger for you guys? Why can't I just measure the components of his plan? Why do I have to see it unfold? Why do I have to introduce gameplay and experiential learning to judge the quality of their plan?
Mr. Hodge, go ahead.
Yeah, let me start off. I think one of the reasons that, and Dr. Long brings up a good point, and I think one of the key reasons is because quite often when we approach difficult problems, we have a number of biases that want to almost simplify the answer for us. And through this visualization, here's an opportunity for things outside our preferred biases to be introduced, and kind of forces upon us to look at a variety of, or a range of options that might have to occur. And so I think that's probably one of the key things and why it needs to be trained. And this is, we think, a preferred method or a recommended method, is so that there is there's a degree of probability that otherwise, if we didn't, we probably wouldn't experience.
So let me add to that. Here's a thing that just occurs to me is 2 points. One, regarding experiential learning, and the two, the notion of simple versus complex experiences, and how they prepare us or fail to. Okay, so experiential learning. We just finished up a major exercise, and my students planned an operation against a thinking and adaptive enemy, and they rehearsed it extensively before they tried to actually employ the plan. And then when they entered into the battlefield, nothing went according to plan. Everything changed, and I don't think there was really one aspect of the plan that stayed the same. And one of the students at the after action review said, we rehearsed this plan to the nth degree, and nothing that we planned for actually occurred. So did we waste our time rehearsing? And my answer was, absolutely not. I mean, the experience of taking the plan, even though that it wasn't executed, and rehearsing it, you experienced, or at least attempted to replicate, some of the challenges in synchronization and integration that you might have while doing such a thing. And that is informative, because as the different players experience this, even though they may not be doing the same actions during the execution phase of the operation, once they get there and things change, they're more prepared than they would have been without that experience. Which relates to the next point, which has to do with simple versus complex ways to get people to think about their plans. We just got done testing a simulation that was a little more complex than what we're used to. And we had an interesting discussion in our institution of its effectiveness. It's more capable than what we've used before, but it's more complex. And therefore, for some people who are intimidated by technology, it might be more difficult to get buy-in and use. So it's wonderful if I have this wonderful simulation that has all these wonderful bells and whistles, and it has capabilities beyond what I've been able to use before, but if I can't get people to be comfortable enough with it to use it effectively, I may not get the outcomes I want. Now, conversely, if I employ a simple analog approach that's maybe not as technologically complex and sophisticated, but apply it to this, but I get more repetitions and run the chance of getting muscle memory, or getting something that it becomes no longer just something that I have read about and I have some cognitive understanding, but now it's become instinct. This is, I think, something that we're trying to get at with this. And I don't have the answer, but I think this is something that people from ABSIL might want to think about. Is it better sometimes to employ simple decision-making games rather than complex ones? Are there other times when a complex one would be more appropriate when a simple analog version would not? What do you think?
Well, this gets back to the underlying assumption that we're using, that visualization is like a muscle. So if you think about if the game you want to play is football, you can prepare to play football by getting into the weight room and lifting weights and building muscle. So you're not doing football skills, but you're actually using a simplified form of stress and resistance to build your capacity. So if we think that that's true about decision making and visualizing, then it's possible to build the skills of visualization by using certain games that exercise the muscle, even if they're not realistic or identical to what's demanded in the world. So let me give you an example of this line of reasoning. When I think about visualizing, what you're actually doing is the following things. You're imagining possible future worlds. You're imagining the probabilities that they could come to pass. You're anticipating actions and reactions and their consequences. You're making an estimate of what you think your opponent will learn from those consequences and how he's going to change his point of view and adjust his future behavior. So you're not only trying to imagine direct consequences of your actions, you're looking at second and third order effects from different perspectives and from different logics. When I sit down to play chess, we're both playing with the same rules and have the same outcomes, but he's on the other side of the board. But in most business experiences or in our military operations, we might have different definitions of success. We might have different values. And I have to learn to look at the battlefield through his eyes. I have to visualize it the way he sees it in order to be a better judge of what he might do. So all of those things are things that I want to do before I actually get into the arena. I don't want to have to learn from failure that I didn't understand him. So I have to learn how to visualize ahead of time so that I can improve my plans. We can then say, how do we learn? How fast can we learn? And how well are we learning? And do these visualization and wargaming techniques get us to solutions more quickly? I'll give one example from a war game we did just 2 days ago. The friendly forces had to move 10 units from an assembly area to a river and defeat an enemy. And so our first visualization caused us to take 1-inch square sticky notes to represent those units and then move those like playing pieces across the map board. And we made an estimate of how long it would take us to do that. Well, when we looked at it more carefully, we said that's actually not a very good tool to visualize those units, because when you put them on the correct scale, it should have been a 5x8 card. It should have been 40 times as large to account for all the people and equipment. And when you put that size of a playing piece on the map to scale, now suddenly all the assumptions about how this battle could unfold had to be dramatically different. When they were in battle formation, a 5x8 card, 5 inches by 8 inches, was the proper representation. But when they were moving along a road at high speed, a 2-foot long piece of string was the right way to visualize that unit. And so by engaging with the game and by studying the trade-off decisions and the representations and the mechanics of the game, we were able to achieve a deeper understanding of the reality instead of taking a simple vision and then trying it out in the real world and failing. The act of visualizing helped us. So we learned from that experience that the way you choose to simulate, how you design the parameters of the game, is really an important part of the process, because you're going to draw conclusions from the game about the world. So that gets into questions about how realistic does it have to be? Does it have to faithfully model every single feature, or can we identify just those essential elements that we're trying to model? And how do we make those decisions in time? That requires some design thinking about our educational outcomes. Any thoughts along those lines?
This is, I don't know how many times I've had this conversation, this argument, typically with people when they get into a gaming situation, and we have this problem in the military especially. Military people want to win, and there's a good reason for this, right? I mean, so if you fail in real combat, people die. Okay, so obviously we're hardwired to win. However, and I got in this argument with one of my students, right? He said, "Sir, you know that we're going to want to win. So that's just going to be part of the terrain here, the human terrain here. People want to win." And I countered with, "You're not here to win, you're here to learn. And unfortunately for you, at least as far as your ego is concerned, that losing sometimes teaches you more. And the reason why we use sims to learn is because now we're not using real human beings where they could possibly be harmed. Instead, we're using simulation to hopefully heighten the learning curve." And so I've been reflecting on this for the last several days quite a bit. My belief is, because, whether it's realistic or not is not, in my view, relevant. It's interesting, but it's not relevant. What is relevant? Well, because one of the things is you will never have a perfect simulation that absolutely replicates reality. We don't possess this technology now. Maybe in the future, but we'll never have that. So the real issue is learning. How much learning is occurring? Now, this goes in crosses disciplines, in my view. For example, if you take an actor and ask an actor to improvise and do an improvisation to prepare them for a role, their whole approach is a process of saying yes and experiencing whatever you tell them the reality is. But for a lot of our students, if you have students who are willing to accept the reality, whether it replicates reality or not, but accept the simulated reality and quit questioning whether it's realistic or not, but just go, okay, whether I think it's realistic or not, what if something like this happened? What would I do? Because then, now it forces them to exercise their visualization capabilities, use their problem-solving capabilities to come up with some options, and then justify the options they recommend to the leader who's got to make the decision. And then if you believe that, then it changes the entire dialogue in regards to what we should be looking for in a simulation. Whether it's realistic or not may not be relevant. Whether it forces me to think and learn and take action may be more relevant. What do you think, George?
Yeah, Dr. Mack brings up a really good point, and we call this what's the approach to simulations in the classroom. And we mentioned earlier that quite often we use a simulation to test and validate our hypothesis. But more importantly, and I think that's the crux of this whole session, is it's also a way to practice your visualization skills. And let me give you another example. If you think of a baseball player, they put him in the batting cage. And why are they putting him in the batting cage? Does he know what pitch is coming at him? No, he doesn't. And so what they're doing is they're training this guy to practice a certain skill, and that is to anticipate the path of the ball that's coming at him. And so we'll start off kind of slow, and we'll throw him some sliders. And then what we'll do is after he develops a good, solid swing pattern and a contact pattern and an eye pattern to watch this, then we'll start changing it up. In other words, we'll ratchet up the degree of complexity. And that's a key point that Dr. Max brought out, is this allows us to do various repetitions, and we can change up the pitches as necessary. And so as the proficiency of the batter increases, then we can increase the complexity of the pitch and the type of pitch that's being thrown. And one of the things that we try to do is explain to the students and the users is, let's quit looking at a plan that has a single idea that the opponent or the enemy is going to do. But what we need to do is we need to think, what can the enemy do, or what can the opponent do? What's his range of options? And so this kind of goes back to the batting cage. Is, yeah, we may start off with some sliders and start developing all those good muscle memories, but as you get more proficient, we're going to ratchet up the degree of complexity. And so by the time he's done, he should have a pretty good muscle memory set at a variety of things that can be thrown his way.
Cool. The final point I want to talk about here has to do with the essential nature of military decision making, and that is that it is a human dimension. There are human factors involved. And our plans are executed by people in a competitive environment, and that gets us into the affective domain, into emotional states. And so we have to become accustomed to making plans and making decisions that involve emotions as well as our rational brain. So if we adopt an approach to conduct a plan and then evaluate it according to some expert rules and metrics and think that we've understood what that plan really means, then we've missed the point. Those plans are going to be executed by people. And so in our last simulation, we had officers fighting against other officers. You know, one was a friendly, one was the enemy forces. And the competitive nature of the environment caused them to experience those competitive adrenaline moments. and they had to learn how to make judgments based on notions of winning and losing, and ego, and obedience and loyalty and conflict on the staff and between commanders and against an enemy. And so part of visualization in this case is not just looking at how those playing pieces are moving on the board, but seeing how they react in that environment once you add competition and uncertainty. And so that really reveals the essence of our plans, that you have to account for people making those decisions and implementing them, and reacting under stress. And so simulations and wargaming allow us to incorporate some of those human factors into decision making that a mere measuring device of a stack of paper can never really approximate. That's a really essential part of our profession. And my spider sense is that there's a lot of business decisions that are affecting the lives of people, their money, and their long-term financial stability and financial freedom. And so there are human factors involved in those kinds of decisions as well. And that's why we think that that wargaming and competition and experiential learning are an essential part of managerial and leader development. Any thoughts on those?
Well, it's interesting that you should bring up the influences of the personalities of the people who are the players on this field of strife, if you will call it that. The opposing force commander I had for this exercise was very different than personality-wise than the person he was facing on the other side, and they were very intuitive and creative, and so in a lot of ways it was somewhat easier for them to make choices because it was just him and two other people working in his cell to create options. And so they just came up with some very simple plans and executed them. Whereas the people they were facing had a big staff trying to come up with options, and oftentimes they were defeated by the complexity of their systems. I just keep coming back to this recurring theme is how does simplicity versus complexity either help or hinder what we're trying to do. So, and this is something people are talking about, I think, because, if you just take what happened recently in Florida with the high school shooting down there, a lot of people are contemplating this horrible tragedy of what occurred and how some people tried to do the right thing, tried to anticipate what was happening or what might come, tried to do the right actions, and then this horrible outcome still happened anyway. So does that mean we don't plan, that we don't rehearse, we don't try to anticipate such bad things, such threats? No, absolutely not. Same thing when it comes to the anticipation and the preparation for opportunities, which I think we are not hardwired for. We tend to think of threats more often than opportunities, but opportunities would be, I think, especially applicable for business and educational leaders as they try to find ways to improve the environments where people seize opportunities, both for businesses and for education. And that's my hope, that if other disciplines will look at what we've done here and apply this to their community, they might find some interesting outcomes in which to apply these findings.
Yeah, one of the things that really strikes me about this is, in this type of model, is the importance of the factor that our bias plays. Left to our own demise, we will probably think of our opponent as kind of a rational actor. And I think it's important, and just as Dr. Mack mentioned about what happened in Florida, that was an irrational actor. And so I think it's important that in our range of preparation, as we looked at the irrational to the irrational, and one of the things that we try to tell people to think about is if you have limited time, one of the things you ought to consider is looking at what we call the most dangerous course of action that the opponent could do to you. And if we plan against what is pretty much an irrational or most dangerous, chances are that whatever we wargame or develop will probably cover down on everything that is above that line as well. And so I think that's probably one of the key things for me to share with people is be careful of your own biases, and it's always good to have somebody who can introduce a range of options to include what we call the non-rational or irrational actors.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. Brings the series to a conclusion. We're getting tremendous payoff already just inside our own college with the distribution and discussion that comes from these webinars. So we're hoping that there's some payoff for you guys out there in ABSEL land as well, and we look forward to talking about this some more in March and in the months and years ahead. We're happy to work with folks from all disciplines on these ideas. We look forward to collaborating with you, and wish you the best of luck going forward. So thanks a lot to George and Rich.
You bet.
And
You bet.